Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be working on chapter 4 now in our book. And last week we went through chapter 3, where we basically um, built really basic applications just to kind of get things up and running, kind of see how they operate, and we started with a blank. And it's kind of an interesting aspect, because we're building apps in a way that is kind of unique to this new platform that Microsoft is pushing out. My goal for today is to go through chapter 4. We're going to be going through the building of all of these apps, hopefully within the next 2 hours, if time plays out as I hope. I do have the book up on the screen here in the form of a PDF, and I'm going to be stepping through it. For those of you who are trying to keep track, this is the book that we're working on. And I do like post this out on YouTube. And, I was really kind of fascinated actually how many hits I was getting on this stuff. Because usually I get my students and maybe a couple of stragglers from the internet. But I was getting, some pretty high numbers. So other people must be looking at this book, or other people must be learning this tech and not really having very good reference materials. And that has been one of my challenges too, because as I teach, I like to teach off of materials that are really built very well. That way, when people step away from my class, they can look at the materials again and go, oh yeah, this is how it works, and I can make it happen. It floors me for as popular as this technology is, how little is written about it, let's say in comparison to like Java, like where Java's got tons and tons of reference materials. Some of them are really excellent. ASP.NET is not like that. It almost seems like it's kind of intentional from all the pros that are doing it, that they don't divulge all their secrets as to how it works, sort of like you should be smart enough to figure it out. And you know what? I think that's a really I'll just say kind of uncool approach. All right, so the point here for today is to go through some of these topics, and you can see I have this kind of expanded out in my PDF, so you can see the grand topics. There are some apps that we're building along the way here. I am also working off of the code repository that is provided by the author, and so if you have the book, right, there's links all over the book to how to get there. But this is the chapter 4 location on GitHub. So I know you guys could pause the video and type in the URL if you wish. And if I was really clever, I'd remember to paste it into the description of the video for future reference. But hey, that's how it goes, right? So you have to tough through it. You can find it pretty easily when it comes down to it. Now, these are complete applications here, each one of these, but I plan on building most of these from scratch as I move forward here tonight. So I'm going to start with an empty project. I'm going to add the stuff in I need, and then do the demonstrations. The demonstrations, for the most part, are pretty simplistic. We're not building anything too intense here, like a whole website. We're just showing how certain things work and why they work the way they do. And that way, when you get to operating your app later, you're like, oh, that's why I did it like this. That's hopefully the why. All right, so this is going to be on my other screen when I need it to refer to as solutions for building code. But for right now, let's talk about the concepts here. And these are basically the main bullet points for the chapter. We keep going on this concept of middleware. What the heck is it? And it really is, in essence, a bunch of code, basically, and you can see the author calls them classes or function that handle an HTTP request or response. And you can chain these functions together with one thing feeding another, right? And then, we think of that as kind of like a pipeline, because it's like, hey, we're running this code, which generates this stuff, which then feeds this thing, and then that feeds that thing. And to give you like a really good example of this, I was working on a snippet of code in a little side hustle thing today with a friend, and we're attempting to basically extract data from an electronic e-commerce clearinghouse site, feed that into a JSON file, take the JSON file, read it into a product catalog, update the prices only from the products, or add new products or remove old products, and then have it propagate to a website, right? And all the little steps that happen in between, we are writing custom code to make those things happen. And then ultimately our goal is to automate it, right? So like, so every day it just runs automatically, and then you don't have to manually do all those steps I talked about, right? So that would be this huge benefit of time. You put a little bit of time in up front, and then you have this working thing. But the way that one part of the coding generates output that feeds the next part of the coding, that's the conception piece, right? The user ultimately doesn't care how the prices or the products get on the website. What they care about is that, is it up to date? Is that the correct price? And is the inventory correct? Right? Um, that's what they care about, right? It doesn't, they don't care what happens in the middle, that there's a bunch of other software happening in the middle doing the stuff that makes the magic happen, right? So that's kind of the conception that you guys should start locking into your brain. All right. So they start talking about middleware here, and you can read this as well as I can, but the whole point is, when you're dealing with software and you're writing stuff, um, things can go bad, they can go good, they can go somewhere in between, you know, and you as the programmer are in control of how it gets from point A to point B. And all right, so once again, they're going back to the definition here. You can see I highlighted a whole bunch of it. Um, I started getting a little less highlight happy as I went through the chapter, by the way, but I thought he was saying some pretty important stuff, or important things, I should say, at the beginning. So, which is why I highlighted them. All right. So, once again, they go back to the C# example. Basically, it's a C# class that can handle an HTTP request or response, right? So it can either ask for information or receive information. So it can handle an incoming HTTP request by generating a response. It can process an incoming request, modify it, and pass it on to another piece of middleware, or process an outgoing response, modify it, and pass it on to another piece of middleware, or to the web server to push out to the web page, right? And the user doesn't care what's happening on the back end, but we as coders do, right? Like, how does this piece of information end up here? It might go through a whole process. Now, when you're doing this, and he does a lot of this diagramming here in the book, which I think at times is really helpful. And then at times I'm finding myself kind of like skipping over it, because isn't this the same diagram I saw before? That's real frankly what my brain does. So I'm not like knocking on your stuff, Andrew. I'm just telling you, that's where my brain goes. One thing to do, make a general point of here, that it seems like for whatever reason now in this day and age, we've moved on to like JSON, or JavaScript object notation, as being one of our primary transmission mediums for streamed data for whatever reason. Even the app that I was working on earlier today with my friend, ultimately we were converting it from an XML based system over to a JSON system. It was so much easier to generate the content that way, real honestly. And then it was also better for the importing, or the pieces that were taking those responses and importing them, because they just handled the information better, because it's already kind of in a format that's native to the web, basically. All right. So the general point is, when we are requesting something of our web app, we have software that sits in the middle. You can just think of each one of those software packages as middleware. And in our code, it may exist as a simple line or two or five of calling something that's pre-built, or calling something that we built, right? Just to kind of give you that difference. The other thing that you'll see here is, for example, is like we already played with the logging piece. Like, so you can set up logging on your application to keep track of what's happening in the browser every time a user hits a thing or gets a resource. We also have the capability, we're going to tinker with this for a little bit, is to deal with static files. So like, not all websites are completely dynamic, right? There's portions of those websites that are completely static, You know, you're just putting information up on the screen. It doesn't have to talk to a database. You know, we're just putting a picture up and some words, or we're using some CSS or some JavaScript to make it kind of animate or style a certain way. But those are static files. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript can all fall into that category, even though the JavaScript and the CSS have the capabilities of doing things, right? We still call it static, right? Because we're not like tying into a data feed of some sort or anything like that. And then we also have at the bottom end there, the endpoint, which we saw once again is, you know, what the user is kind of interacting with ultimately, like what, like based on this URL, what are you dishing out to them? You know, that's kind of what this is right now. All right, so this concept of the pipeline again, and I think we've said this enough, right? Where a piece of middleware can call another piece of middleware, which in turn can call another, and so on, is a pipeline. So when we say these words, that's what we mean. Now, I'm going to be real frank. I'm not comfortable with these words because I've never really thought of these things as such. I never defined them as middleware. I never defined them as a pipeline. I always thought of it, hey, we're just chaining functions, you know, or we're chaining, we're taking one piece of code and it's feeding another piece of code. I never really thought of it as, wait, that's a separate little application, because it really kind of is. And what you'll see here, that .NET Core has built into it a bunch of standardized middleware components that you can just call in. Well, that's kind of interesting, right? So like one example of that is when we did like that very first app build where it had got it like generated a whole website, right, with like an about page, and if you wanted you could add like logging in and stuff. Those are just pre-built tools, right? So this is what we're talking about. So there's things that we can just request, right? All right, so now they're pointing out here, and maybe I should have highlighted this, right? This is, I think, kind of important. It says, sometimes when people are visiting a website, basically, there's a need to occur for every request. So doing a log is pretty standard. Adding security headers. So in other words, we're pushing it out through HTTPS, or we're encrypting the data in transit somehow. Associating the request with the relevant user. So if, you know, Joe comes to my web page, I don't want to send him Sally's web page request. I want to send him Joe's web page request. And then also setting the language for the current request. That's not something we think about here a lot in the US, but when we're in other countries, right, who's to say that people are looking at our stuff in English, right? The code might be written in English, but the language of consumption might be Spanish or French or German, or, you know, what have you. All right. So when we start to throw these other pieces in there, like authentication and authorization, they will make responses of their own. So they'll intercept things before they get to the endpoint. So for example, if the user's hoping to log into their account and see their user account page, well, that's not going to happen if they're not logging in correctly, you know, in simplistic terms. Right? And I'm trying to get down here to, you know, the ultimate, you know, response really is what we call, you know, terminal middleware. So in other words, if we encounter something along the way in the process of trying to get to where we're going and we can't get to where we're going, well, that thing that's interceding, whether it's like a wrong password, you know, that's the terminal middleware. Okay, you're not getting any farther because you don't know how to get past this point, or you don't have the authorization to get past that point. All right, so they talk here a little bit about the HTTP context object. You guys can read up on that on your own. But really what they're kind of trying to point out here is this thought that depending on the types of middleware you're throwing into the mix here, you know, and authentication is a very common one, right? That certain things exist in context relative to this encapsulation. He uses the um, analogy of the Russian doll, right? You know, where you have like all these identical kind of software pieces basically encapsulated inside of each other. But if you want to get to the one in the middle, you got to get through all the other ones first to get there, right? And like a lot of the code is kind of generated that way. That is unfortunately necessary in a lot of today's dynamic systems, right? You don't want anybody from the internet just getting into the system, having access to like sensitive data or information or what have you. So that is a concern. Now, whenever we are working with HTTP, and he's going to do like this little thing here about this in just a moment in the book. Um, every time we go to a website, we just have this naive assumption, okay, well, I know the link, so I'm clicking on it, or I typed in the URLs and then pressed enter, and then I'm just going there. So, for example, I have a high degree of certainty that if I went to my web browser and typed in like youtube.com and pressed enter, that YouTube would indeed come up on my screen, right? However, right, and here's the big however. What if YouTube is down? Okay, rare, highly unlikely, but it does happen. In fact, I was a little shocked, and I'm not sure what day it was exactly. Maybe it was like Thursday or Friday or something like that. I'm an avid like Google News reader, right? For whatever reason, it's just like my preferred news aggregator of choice. And I went to the app and I opened it, and I'm like, uh-oh, it's not working. It was kind of like, oops, it's not, nothing's here. And I was like, oh no, where do I get my news from? Like when like very uncharacteristically saw an error message from a Google service, and I didn't like, get like a traditional error message. Right? Like what's a traditional error message when your connection fails? Like, do you guys know the error codes?
404.
Yeah, like 404, 50.
Yeah, the 404 is the most common, right? So, like, and I'm going to see if I can kind of create this to happen, right? So I'm going to try to bring up like my school server page, and then I just come up with like a nonsense page name, right? And then okay, so it says forbidden. I don't have any access, but the reason this is happening is that there is no such page as the one I just typed in, right? So our server is not finding it. So it's saying you don't have permission to access this resource. But the reality is the page doesn't exist. And normally this is what we call a 404 error, page not found. And there's a whole series of error codes that HTML generates. And I'm trying to get to that section here really quick, and then we'll backtrack as soon as I find it. Right here, right? So the HTTP response status codes, and basically they have, 5 different prefix numbers that they start with. And this is really kind of interesting because most of the time we don't see it at all, right? However, we can code to the response. So for example, I was writing a piece of code today that if the page loads successfully, I can execute a piece of code. And typically the success code is a 200 code, right? So the response message for success, right? Meaning the request was successfully handled in process is a 200, right? Where if I look at a 400, it's a client error. A problem occurred with the request sent invalid data, for example, or the user isn't authorized to perform the request, like to access a file you don't have access to or doesn't exist, right? If you get a 500 error, there's a problem with the server. A 400 error means you're an idiot. No, I'm kidding. 400 error means, you're asking for something that generally isn't there, right? If you get a 300, that's a redirection. So the browser must follow the provided link to allow the user to log in, for example. And then you have a 100 level code too, which is just informative. And notice this is not often used. it just basically isn't used, is really the polite way to say it. All right. So that's kind of my little spiel on that stuff, right? So he gets into it in a little bit. All right. So we're now moving to here. So what we're going to try to do next is we're going to create a blank project. So we're going to try this holding page thing. And one of the weird little aspects of this, real frankly, is all these little automatic tools that we have access to. And if you go into the course shell, so the people that are in my course right now, I created this little list here. So here's the URL for those of you online watching the video or whatever. This comes right from Microsoft. Microsoft has a complete list here of the built-in middleware. So this is just part of the ASP.NET Core platform, right? So all you have to do is invoke these services. And if you just kind of look through here, right? So authentication, authorization, cookies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you guys can read through the list. You notice, you know, we have some logging in there, output and response caching, session stuff, static files. I was reading up on this a little bit earlier. You can see I followed the link already, WebSockets, etc. But these are ones that are already pre-built, and all we generally have to do is use the right use statement to pull that into our code. And then it becomes part of our app by just simply invoking it. It is middleware. It is designed to take usually inputs of data somehow and then provide a response of some sort or move you through the process, and really are designed to be part of a pipeline as middleware. That's their designation and their design right from the get-go. Right. So that's I think a very helpful little list there. All right. What I wanted to do next is I want to kind of show you this really simple example of how you can build a website and very quickly add a page that looks like the one that we're looking at without really coding a darn thing, right? Well, within reason. Right? So here's what I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to open up Visual Studio here. You guys should do the same. I am going to create a new project. And you guys let me know if I'm going too quick. I can slow down here if need be. For right now, we're still going to stick with the template of ASP.NET Core empty, right, which we did before. Since we did it before, it should be on your recent project template list. If not, narrow down by choosing the language, C#, go to the third drop down here and choose web. And then you should be able to find that here on the list. So here it is on the list. I'm going to choose it from this list though. Hey, why not? I'm going to click next. And then this one's going to be called creating a holding page. I'm just naming it the same thing as the author, just so we have consistency. If it's helpful for you, and this is, you know, a preference thing, some people might opt to do maybe a little prefix on it so you know like which chapter it is. So you could do like C4. This is the first app. The author uses the letter A. So you could do something like that. I'm not going to do that. Okay, I'm just going to go with creating a holding page. I'm pretty confident I can find it later. All right. You can see that my storage location, I'm storing this on my Google Drive, sorry, Microsoft, but that's just where I choose to put my class stuff. So it's working just fine with my Google Drive, by the way. I have had issues in the past with Microsoft products and Google Drive, but .NET Core seems to work okay. I am not putting the solution and the project in the same directory. I'm just kind of leaving the default, which is to leave that unchecked. When I go to the second tab here, I'm working with .NET 7. Some of you might only have 8. It should be fine. Ideally, you're on 7, so we follow the book. I'm going to uncheck HTTPS. It adds a lot of overhead. I think we've discussed that. Docker's unchecked also. And then I'm also leaving unchecked the top level statements. And I'm going to tell you, I think that this is really confusing. And hopefully a Microsoft person watches this, like the person who developed this little checkbox, because it does the opposite of what it says. And I always fall victim to it. Um, you would think that when you click the box, it removes all the namespace stuff, but it's the opposite. It's unchecked that it removes the namespace stuff. And that's really the kind of the preferred way to work for some simple ASP.NET Core applications. I'm going to go ahead and click create. We're going to let it do a build out. All right. And then because I'm working on a cloud drive, sometimes it tells me to either reload or ignore. If you guys get that box up, you may or may not, but I typically am getting this. Just click ignore. That's my suggestion. All right, the base of the project is here, and where I'm going to go to immediately is just the program. Oh, there it is, right? There we go. So I'm going to ignore, and then we're going to go to program.cs here. There we go. Took a few more clicks than I wanted it to. All right, so this is the default when you don't put anything in. And if you guys remember, if you hit run on this, I'm going to go ahead and do it just to show you. So here comes the run. See where my browser comes up on screen number 2, of course. And it's just a simple hello world app. I'm going to go ahead and close this. I just want to just kind of refresh your memory on that. I didn't do anything to create this aside from just hit create, right? And make a couple of selections. What I am going to do though, is I'm going to get rid of this line of code. And I instead am going to use one of the pre-built middleware components. So I'm going to call an app, which is our local app right now. And then I'm going to use the keyword use. And for whatever reason, they decided in Microsoft world or whatever, that use and using are the way that they incorporate pre-built libraries and tools. Right? Using statements, which we've seen already, are ones that go at the top of your program code, would be the equivalent of like an import statement in Java. That's just basically allowing you to import a library of some sort. When I use the use statement, not using, but use, these are all correlated to that list that we were just looking at on the Microsoft website of pre-built middleware components. And if you kind of like look through here, you can see, oh yeah, it kind of looks like that list. And there might even be a couple extras. The one that we're looking for is the use welcome page. And you can see how I highlighted it. And now that it's highlighted, I could double click or press enter or tab, right, to kind of auto type it. And I had to press tab twice to complete the statement. Now, this is a simplistic example. This is one of the apps we're building this time around. And now we're going to launch this. And when it launches, once again on screen number 2, eventually I'll train it to go to the right screen. You see I have that same welcome page that they have in the book. And I didn't style this. I didn't create the images. I didn't put the words on the page. None of it. This is just default, right? What is it? It's just a very simple page that looks better than Hello World, right? But for all intents and purposes, it really is kind of as simple. We didn't write any of this HTML. So if I right click and view source and I go, oh my God, look at all this like CSS and, stuff. I didn't create this. Who created this? Somebody at Microsoft. They've made it part of the middleware. It loads it up automatically. It comes from some library that I can't access, but it's there. And if I'm spinning up an app quickly and I just want to see if it's working, this is kind of a quick, easy way to do it. Could I create my own fancy page that did the same thing? Yes, you could. So this is the first of the apps for this chapter, folks. So that's your code. Screenshot it. Screenshot that welcome page. That's kind of your task, right? All right. I'm going to go ahead and close this app here, and I'm going to move on in the content. And really, what we're trying to point out here is that piece, the welcome page middleware is pre-built. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. He did it, not me. That kind of thing. So, and when you start thinking about the other pieces that they're throwing around in that library, once again, if you come here, well, you know what? Some of these pieces might be necessary, for doing whatever I'm doing on a page. And if I have that capability of just importing the libraries and utilizing them, that's what I do. Why build it from scratch when it already exists and when it works well? All right, so I think that covers that first exercise pretty well. Let's go ahead and move forward in the book. Now, they're making a point here code-wise that when you look at your code, that's the only piece of middleware in the pipeline, right? You're using the welcome page. The two intro pieces, those have to be there just to run the app, right? And then the command to actually run it and receive requests. The web server is running. But hopefully when you took a look at that list, you noticed, okay, there's a bunch of tools that we can pull in. And what's I think really kind of neat about it is we kind of use this convention of use and then the name of the thing. And then when you get to the point where maybe you're building your own stuff, like I was kind of doing that today and I wasn't even thinking about it as middleware, right? But I was just doing that today as just part of a project. And that's totally what it was doing. And then once the thing is working, I could name it use whatever if I was working in this format. This, the one I was working on today was all in PHP, by the way, which just happened to work with the website that we were working on. But, it could be .NET. The concept really is the same. That's the point. Another kind of interesting thing to do is to handle static files. So like one of the middleware pieces that you'll notice here is the static file one. And I was reading up on this one before, because what I noticed is when I was working with the app that I was tinkering with, it didn't automatically include components for web. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird, right? So how do I do that for one thing, right? So let's go ahead and let's build another blank project. So I'm going to just grab that same template and build another one. And this one, let's see, what are we going to call this one? I'm trying to like follow the author's naming. Creating a static file website. That's what it's called. Right. So that's what I named it. Still going with .NET 7, turning off HTTPS. None of these boxes are checked. And then I'm clicking create. We're going to ignore that silly message. And then while I'm sitting here, and I just want to like kind of give you guys an anatomy of the application too. When I started reading up on the static files, I'm like, okay, well, I see in the book, and I think the author does this quite a bit. He talks about, oh, when we're working with web pages, and I was making this point before, often the content isn't necessarily dynamic. Sometimes it is static, whether it's words on a page or JavaScript or CSS or whatever. And images are another one of those things that are kind of just static things that we throw into a project. But our project folders will have a folder called the www root folder within the project. What I noticed is when I was building projects from scratch, though, I'm like, where is this magic folder? Right? It doesn't get added automatically. If I did one of the pre-built templates where it kind of gives you the whole website right off the bat, it does do that, right? And so it adds that piece. But for us, what we're going to have to do is come here and we're going to have to add a new folder, and we're going to call it www root, right? And notice the moment after I added it, and I'm going to just repeat those steps because I know I did it really fast. So I right clicked on the project, root of the project. I chose add and then new folder, right? That was the pathway. And I apologize because sometimes I do some of these tasks really fast and intuitively, not remembering it. Some people go, what was that? And then you're rewinding the video, but this is reality, so you can't rewind it. But I thought it's also kind of fascinating because, okay, so here's this folder, right? And it changed, the icon changed from like a folder icon to a little planet or whatever. And this is where stuff that gets pushed out to the web. This is kind of like your FTP folder or something on, a regular web account. This is where the stuff gets pushed that you want to feed to the website that isn't done programmatically. So if I go now to my G drive where this is stored, so you guys can see my whole crazy folder structure here, right? And this is creating a static file website, and I go into the folders, I now see a www root folder, which is indeed empty, right? Not very exciting. Now, what the author has on the GitHub site, right? And I don't want to do that, but they have this graphic here, right? And they have this graphic here. And, what I'm going to suggest is basically just go ahead and download the files from here. Or if you wish, you want to download a couple of your own, that's fine too. But now that they're in my downloads folder, I'm going to grab both of those, cut them, and then move them over to this www root folder. And you know what? I can do it through my file interface, but you can also, if I'm not mistaken, I think I can drag and drop them right into Visual Studio. And in fact, let's just try that. I haven't done that in a long time, but let's see if I can just drag and drop them right in there. And there they are. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys just a moment to catch up and do that step. Now I'm trying to get, gosh, I guess all of my ducks in a row here. So I'm going to move this GitHub stuff off my screen, back over to screen number 2 with you. And, in terms of like what happens, in the main program CS file, once again, we're going to get rid of this like root call to hello world, right? So we're just going to blow that away. So in the middle where we're going to try now is the static file thing. So I'm going to start with use. I'm just going to start typing static. You can see it comes up, use static files. I'm going to press enter, then hit tab to get the rest of the code and lock it in. And here's kind of the thing with this when I run this. So let's go ahead and hit the run button on this. And this is kind of enlightening, I think. So watch what happens here. So the application builds, it launches the server, and here it is, it's running. Okay, is there something wrong here? No, there's nothing wrong. Here's what happened. I don't have a default thing to load. I don't have the welcome page loaded. I don't have my hello world loaded. Right, it's just saying use static files. Which files? It didn't specify. Right, and I just want to clarify what this means. Is once this is in place, it allows me to take any static files that I have in my project. Doesn't matter if it's an image, JavaScript, CSS, or whatever, and then I can call it in through the URL where the server is listening and access that file. So if I go back to that same page here and then just simply append to the URL the name of one of those files, for example, like moon.jpg, I can load it. Or if I bring up, what was the other one, mountain.jpg, that will load. Right. Where is it loading it from? That folder. Right. If I had a folder structure, so for example, if I had an images folder, or a media folder or a code folder or whatever the folder is, that URL or folder structure would simply be appended to the end of the URL like a regular HTML URL, right? So I could, for example, build an ASP.NET website. I'm just kind of giving you an idea here. Simply call in, maybe have a launch to whatever the main page is, put in the use static files, and then it can just run it like a regular plain old HTML website through here. Kind of an interesting thought. Now, the question you should ask yourself in that scenario is, why on earth would I do that? Exactly. Why would you? Right? When you can just use regular HTML. But the whole point is that you can incorporate static HTML components easily into your application. And sometimes that's completely necessary and pertinent, right? But this is how it's done. You use that command. Now, if I were to stop this and I wanted to, for example, use not MVC, but use my welcome page. I don't like it when it's not auto typing nicely for me. And then I'm fumbling on the keyboard on top of it all. Right. So I could still put that in there and run it, and it will go, of course, to the welcome page, which it did. There it is. But then if I want, I can also still bring up the mountain. Right, so I can have it land me somewhere else, but any of the resources within the project are present. If I wanted to give you a much fancier demonstration, I could load up a whole bunch of like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, yada, 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 and call that up, and that would load too. Right, as long as it's in that folder, you're good. So that's the second app build, you guys. Why don't we do this? We're about halfway through the class right now. I'm going to go ahead and hit the pause recording, and we're going to take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and pick up where we left off. All right, we're back from our break, and I think we pretty well talked about that. I did highlight this paragraph here because I do think it's important. It says that that's the only folder in the application that .NET's going to serve files from. No other files anywhere else in your app can ever be delivered directly to a browser. They can create the code that gets delivered to the browser, but they don't actually get delivered. So that's a security thing, right? So that's what they're kind of trying to point out here. By that way, like if you have certain things that aren't so sensitive, like an image maybe isn't so sensitive, you can put that stuff in that folder, right? They walk through like the whole process of how it works, and I think we explained it fairly well. The one thing that we didn't do though is like what happens if the request fails, right? So if I put in like, if I put in moon or mountain, it works. But what if I put in, or misspell mountain, what happens then? Well, when I go, well, in this case, it goes back to my welcome page. Not a good solution, by the way. So if I strike that, stop the app, run it again. Right, so now we're back to that. But if I, there's my mountain, here's my mountain misspelled, and then it just gives me this. It is a 404, so this is generated by the browser, right? As a client-side error, page not found, but it is generating a 404. If you're keeping score, basically. They do, talk about the 404 error code. What a lot of people don't realize is one of the worst things you can do on a website is to have a situation where it gets that kind of a page, right? Like if somebody doesn't find a page on your website, do you really just want a blank page like that? You can actually create a 404 page, and a lot of people don't even think about that. So you can create a page that responds to 404 to give you something a little bit more meaningful. So then you can actually pump yourself back into the framework of your website and give them the opportunity to go somewhere else or do something else rather than just some like, oh, I guess the website's broken. I'm going somewhere else. I'm going to spend my money elsewhere, right? That kind of thinking. So that is a thing that you can do for sure, right? All right, so they kind of go through that whole process, and we already talked about the error codes and the response codes. All right, so now we're going to move on to section 4.2.3, and we're going to start talking about what they're calling a minimal API application. So let's go ahead and actually build the next little piece here that they're asking for. Right now, you know, they're telling us that basically the response pages or the endpoints really do come from Razor. We're not at the point where we've learned that yet, but that's coming, right? But we're going to look at this kind of weird little thing here. So what we're going to do is we're going to build what they're showing here to experiment with it and figure out why this works or doesn't work. So that's my kind of my next goal here. So on my other screen that you guys aren't seeing, I'm pulling up the sample code. And what I'm going to do is the next two app builds here. So I'm going back to my course homepage. And let me just pull this up here. So you guys have a underpinning as to what we're doing. So we've completed the first two bullet points, and I'm about to do the third and the fourth, and these kind of get combined together, by the way. So let's go ahead and build, and then we're going to add basically the code that you see here to make this happen, but we're going to do it one little piece at a time with the explanations. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is back over to Visual Studio. I'm going to close this solution file, and then I'm going to create another brand new project. We're going to go with the ASP.NET Core empty with C# for the web once again. And this one we're going to call, let's just call it minimal APIs, like that. All right, and we're just going to keep it simple. This is going to cover two apps because we're going to take the one amp and then we're going to wrap it up and just hand it in as one file, basically. Once again, .NET 7, nothing checked on that last screen. And then we'll go ahead and build. I'm going to ignore that little message, and then we're going to bring up the program.cs file. Now, the first thing that they want us to add here is we're going to leave hello world in place. Right? That's one of our endpoints. But we are going to call in, and I'm going to do this somewhat sequentially here. So, for example, let's have the ability to call in static files. We can do that, right? So we want to look at our moon, we can look at our moon, right? The other thing that we're going to use, you see, I went right to the keyword use instead of what I meant to use here, which is this other piece that happens kind of automatically in these apps, and that is the routing, right? And this is kind of interesting because this handles how things move around in the application. Okay, so that we're just adding these two pieces in. Another one that we're going to start kind of concerning ourselves with now in development mode, and this is really important, this next one that I'm adding in, which is the developer exception page, this is a piece that when we're in development mode for our app is automatically invoked. So if something fails and we're generating an exception code, you know, an error code that we can go, oh, error, 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever, and we can look up the error code and what it means, or as Visual Studio is really great at doing, sometimes gives you fixes and stuff. This piece is actually typically not something that you would manually invoke, and this is what the author says about it. This can be omitted. It is added automatically when you're in build mode. It's already there. Now, so in other words, This is not something you want to use during production mode necessarily, because it can expose your code to somebody who's malicious. So in other words, if there's an error in your programming code on line 15 in your program CS file, that would actually throw an error code on the in the browser that they could then look at and go, oh, that's your code. Okay, now I know how to hack you, right? Is kind of the thinking. But in development mode, this is automatically invoked, right? Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that's just in place, ready to handle an exception if it happens, right? Is it always going to happen? No, we're waiting for something to happen. Is a user always going to try to access a static file? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. Are they always going to use routing? Yeah, probably, but maybe, maybe not, once again. And so when I run this app, what is going to happen? So if I hit the run button on this, you will, of course, see the glorious hello world, meaning that even though I have middleware in a pipeline preceding hello world, none of it really is applying at the moment. But if I want, I can still look at the moon. Right? No, I can't. Why can't I look at the moon? Because I don't have those files here. Right. That's really the answer. So if you wanted, for example, to add those same files to the application, you could, and then the static files would be used. So if you want to practice with that once again, just right click the project, add new folder, www, 3Ws, root, changes the icon, and then of course you can grab your little moon and mountain or whatever and drag them into that folder or whatever pages you wish, right? And then when I run it again, we'll be able to access those, right? So that's just kind of the lay of the land on that. Now, if you go back to the book here, you know, they start talking about all the things I just did really super quickly. So I'm trying to get like a little more efficient with how we're presenting the information here. So you can actually, when we get to those endpoint pieces, right? That's the, responding to that get thing that happens in the URL. What I think is kind of more interesting about this is some of these other pre-built middleware pieces that kind of happen automatically, that we don't necessarily need to explicitly add to the application. And that includes that, these couple of pieces here that we are going to kind of take for granted over time, right? But the developer exception page middleware, right? So whenever you're in the dev mode, that's automatically added. If you want to add it in production, well, then you got to start being careful about how you're using it. Do you want to expose your code to the world? Probably not. But here's some other ones, though, that are kind of automatic once we're in there. The endpoint one is one of the automatic ones, right? So we don't have to explicitly call that in to use it. It's just there for our use, right? Now, if you start breaking down, the way that this is all kind of featured in here, right? Once again, we're going back to one of these things. There are things in the pipeline here that we may or may not hit depending on what tool we're aiming for, right? So if we're shooting to get that moon picture, then it will basically short circuit in this spot. If our application throws an exception, then we will short circuit in this spot, right? So, the general point is, why then are you adding something that automatically is there? Okay, so the point is, and he makes a point of this here, and I think it's a really good point. It's related to the logic of your application ultimately, right? So by putting it in specifically in a certain spot, we don't want it basically to execute certain code prior to reaching other code. So in other words, we are in control of when stuff happens rather than, oh, well, if this is automatically there, just let it do it. Right. Well, in some cases that's okay, but in other cases it is not. And it really depends ultimately on the logic of your application. Right. Now, the weird thing about this is, and this is kind of the interesting aspect, is what if you have two pieces of middleware that are listening for the same path? So in other words, you have two calls in your code that are reacting to the root of the application, right? And so for example, if I add the welcome page here at the top, what's the result? And really the best thing to do is actually just to try that. So I'm going to go back to program CS. I'm going to do the app dot use, and actually what are we doing? We're going to use the welcome page. And then I want you to notice here that we're going to use the welcome page, but it's going to listen for the root application here is what it's listening for. So at this point, I think we're on exercise D, which is the minimal APIs and welcome page example. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just doing that. So you can actually explicitly put it in like that, or if I put this in here, what's going to trigger first? Is it going to say hello world, or is it going to use the welcome page? Well, to me, it's
the welcome page, right?
Yeah, right. It reads top down. So, I mean, it's kind of a no brainer. So if I go ahead and launch this, and of course it comes up with the welcome page. Of course it does. Right. If I were to close this, and let's say I put the welcome page, after, I think it's also pretty intuitive what's going to happen here. Now you should be saying, wait a second, what just happened?
Is it because it was the last thing to run?
If I put it here, I still get the welcome page. So what if I change this? Yeah, you can see it because I have the app still running, right? And so they're changing it. All right. Still comes up there, right? Well, we do get conflicts, basically, but do the conflicts matter as to the order relative? Because it is now it seems like I can't get hello world no matter what I do. Isn't that interesting, right? But what if I type in the root? I still get that, right? So this is really, I think, a pretty interesting example in terms of, you got to think about like your endpoints and where you're trying to propagate it to, because what ends up happening is, yeah, you can have things fighting over the same resources, but apparently it seems like the use has priority over the other, right? So that's the I'm going to call those the third and the fourth apps here, right? And they're kind of pointing out here, even though the endpoint middle can also handle that root path because it's early in the pipeline, so it returns a response when it receives that short-circuiting the pipeline. And I think we kind of proved that the hard way, but we also learned that other welcome page can be problematic when it gets past the routing and has to conflict with the actual endpoint that we set up, right? So you got to think about that real carefully when you're building, by the way. right. I'm going to go back to Visual Studio here. I'm going to close this one down. So I'm just going to do a closed solution and leave the product running. Yeah, sure. Go ahead and save it. So those are the third and fourth exercises, by the way. All right, so the next part that we're going to talk about is just a little bit of exception handling and basically dealing with errors either in your code or whatever, or your interactions with your code. And you'll notice that little highlight that I have there. It says the design philosophy for .NET Core is that every feature is opt-in. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting thought. So because error handling is a feature, you need to enable it explicitly in your application. All right, and I want you to think about this really carefully, because sometimes when your code is failing, right, you might use exception handling in the build process to work out all the bugs in your code, right? So in other words, I might throw in exception handlers so that while my code is running, if it doesn't work, it gives me a message that says, hey man, your code's not working, you should fix it because this is the error code, right? But when you're in production mode, do you necessarily want your user to see any of that, right? And this is kind of, kind of the grand, point of this, really, right? Do the users care what your exception code is? Probably not, right? Would the users like a way to keep on interacting with your website and maybe give you money, right? Yes, the answer is usually yes to something like that. All right, so one thing that we sometimes run into, right? So like if we are running any piece of middleware, so any like codable little module or whatever that we're throwing in that fails, right? We need to have the ability to respond to that failure. And what are we going to do if it fails? At least, from the viewpoint of the user, right? And this is something that has to be an issue. If there's an exception code, generally that's a server error. So you're going to get a 500 code back in the browser, right? Meaning it's nothing you did, nothing you clicked on. It's over here where we have our web pages. That's what's broken. Right? And depending on what level that exception happens, that can stop the application right at that point. Right? That's kind of the other aspect of this. So moving on to this next little thing that we're going to do, we're going to throw this piece in, which we already did, right? So we did one application where we kind of threw that in the previous one. And notice that for what the highlight says, usually when you're coding, you want as much info as possible when you're developing stuff, right? So like you want to know the error code so you know what to fix and you know how to track it down. Right. So you have this thing, but normally this is automatic in the dev mode. It's in production mode where you have to be careful. So we don't actually have to add that line to our code. It will throw an exception anyhow. And then the warning, never use it in production. It's a security risk, right? Because you're giving people, in some cases, access to code that's problematic. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to build the next app, which is actually very simplistic. So I want you guys to follow along with me here. And our goal here is basically to forcibly trigger what we're seeing on the screen here, just to kind of show you a couple things about what happens if you are doing it, right? Or if you're in dev mode and you want to see those codes, right? So we're going to go ahead, make another new project, right? ASP.NET Core empty and C# for web. This one we're going to call developer exception page. No HTTPS, all the boxes are unchecked. All right. and then I'm going to go into the code file here. I am going to get rid of my, well, okay, we're going to hotwire this. I'm not going to get rid of the map get, but here's where we're going to start. First place I'm going to start is by copying the author's comments, right? It says in development, this is already added by web application. You should never do this in production as it can leak secrets. Right? What secrets? Your code, right? What can the code contain? Well, all sorts of stuff, including, connection strings and things you don't want to share. Right. So we're going to go ahead and explicitly add it just for this standpoint of remembering that we're doing that. So we're adding the user, the use developer exception page. And then I'm going to hotwire this request here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call in something I'm going to create. Now, I'm a big fan of trying to save time here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a little snippet of code in the chat, right? Which I'm adding here at the bottom. So I'm building an internal class file. This could be a separate standalone file too called badservice.cs, but I'm putting it in internally. But basically, I'm going to make this automatically throw an exception. So instead of saying hello world here, I'm going to say bad service dot get values. And really all I'm doing is I'm reaching into this class, I'm triggering this method. And what does that method do? It throws an exception, forcing an exception to happen. Why? To see what it looks like, basically. All right, so here's the save. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit the run. Here is the output screen. I just want to show you, I think really the anatomy of this. I'm zooming out on this just so you guys know. So this is what we triggered to happen. And it says an unhandled exception occurred while processing the request. And it starts to give you a whole bunch of information here. And if you start to look, and they start to point this out in the book, so I'm going to flip back there really quick, right? So they have, basically the anatomy of it, right? So the title indicating the problem. Okay, not very helpful in this regard. The detail of the exception that occurred, a null reference exception. Do I have that in mind? Not exactly, right? That's not what I'm getting. Location where the exception occurred. And notice here, they're pointing to the specific line in the code that's triggering it. And am I getting the same thing here? I am not. I'm not getting that same breakdown that they are. However, and you can see I'm like clicking on all the little pieces here. Yeah, so I'm assuming that this is more of an issue of how this is being sent. So I'm looking for those like same line numbers basically, and I'm not getting them, and that's more typical. So this is showing like the raw data. And if you're trying to troubleshoot something, this information could be helpful. I think what's fascinating though is that there is a difference in the output, and I don't know if this is Visual Studio or the browser, and it's probably important to note that I'm not using Edge, and I'm guessing the author's using Edge. Right? God forbid. But because this is actually a null reference exception, it actually points to a certain line in the code. And often you do get those errors that point to certain lines in the code. The problem that you get with that, here's the problem, is that because and I'm just wondering if this is like a security feature in the browser now. If you can actually return, right, like certain snippets of code, and I'm not seeing that in their example, right? This is why it's kind of perplexing me a little bit, because apparently on their line 15 in their code, they are return a null object to string. Um, Not a good thing to do, by the way. And so that's why it's pointing to that spot. But you can actually see the code. You can see the function calls and the parameters and all the stuff being sent. Not good, right? You don't want to expose that code logic to the public, generally speaking. Yeah. The thing that kind of gets me here though is if they are using, and I'm looking at his next example here, so just bear with me, and you guys can't see me doing this to see if he added that. No, he didn't add that at all. Okay. All right. So here's where we go next with this, right? So this is the last part of this chapter is as we take this app now, and this one will cover the last two apps, the one app build that we're doing here. I'm going to add a couple of things here, right? So the first thing that I'm going to do is here in the use developer exception page thing, and actually, I'm doing a little double check here, so I apologize because you guys aren't seeing what I'm looking at. Yeah, we use the page thing here. Now, you know what? Actually, let's do a new app. So I apologize for this. We're going to do a brand new app on this, and I'll just give you guys the code. So I'm going to go ahead and close this one. Yeah, it's still running, so we've got to close it. Making a new project, empty once again. And this one we're going to call exception handler middleware. So let's just type that out. Exception handler middleware. Ignoring. We're going to program.cs. And then we're going to start building. And for those of you that are here in the session with me, yeah, I'm going to give you code and snippets here. So here's the first snippet of code. And I'm going to basically add that here up near the top. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm adding a straight up exception handler, and it's going to refer to a URL, right? So it's going to take us to an error page, right? So it's creating an endpoint is what it's doing, right? The other thing that, right, we're going to do here is we're going to check, are we in development mode, right? And in that case, then we do use that exception handler, right? So, and that's why the comment. Normally, this would only be used in production. You rely on the middleware that's automatically added, right? But here we're explicitly adding it for development mode as well. If you see what I mean. Okay, so this will run if we happen to be in development mode. We are. That's why we're adding the if statement. All right. Once again, we're going to add that bad service class to the bottom here. If you don't have it handy, there it is in the chat. I'm going to add that class here at the bottom so you guys can pause your videos or whatever and copy in that code. Same thing we did in the last one. Right. And then we're going to change our routing here, or our endpoints. Basically, we're going to change the hello world. So we're going to strike hello world, and we are going to paste in bad service get value. So we're throwing the exception and forcing the error message. But we're also going to throw in another endpoint, and we haven't done this yet. So here it is also in the chat. pasting it right there. What are we going to put on the screen if it does indeed fail? You're going to throw a 404 error? You're going to give them some cryptic printout of your source code with, maybe passwords and connection strings built into it? Heck no, you're not going to do that at all, right? You're going to put up a custom error message. In this case, we're just putting text on the screen, but it could be a page that you're going to, or it could be a page with content injected, or, you can imagine the scenario. All right, so I'm saving this. Let's execute and see what happens. So now we're once again letting this load up. Give it a second here because this might take a moment to trigger the error.
The error should already be triggered.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's throwing an error here inside, right? Visual Studio, right? You notice it's got a little red X. It's not good, by the way. Right. And and basically it's saying that this is an unhandled exception. So if I click this, right, this is what I should see in the browser. So it's saying, all right, this is what we're going to push to the user in those situations. It didn't happen automatically though, because we are, in development mode, right? So this is kind of the whole point of it. So this is the error message that we're forcing it to generate. And that's really basically kind of the crux of that little exercise, is making that piece happen. Just a couple of things that it says about it. Why not in production? Once again, because it can leak information about your app to potential attackers, which is not good. Normally we should get some sort of an error message such as this. One of the reasons why we do these things is, once again, if you do have an error, right? So I want you to think about this. If you do have an error in your application, or maybe, maybe one of the software middleware pieces isn't working right, do you want it to show that 404 page or 500 page or whatever? Instead, you can keep it canned inside your application, right? So inside your framework, your menus, your footer, header structures, and the error can appear as just another page that they can then navigate out of to a part of your application that is working if one part isn't. That's really kind of the grand takeaway on this. So that's kind of like a more elegant way to handle the exception, right? And then they're just showing you that you can just kind of code your way around it, really, is a polite way to say it. All right, folks, that really covers the chapter 4 content. If you guys want to keep reading, of course, the chapter on your own, that's absolutely fine. I think I covered all of these topics ultimately. And then there's the summary. All right. And, it's good to read the author's viewpoint on all this as well. But this video will end here. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well, because more videos will be coming. We're just going to be stepping through the book as far as we can. This is chapter 4 that we just finished today. And next week, we're going to try to be a little more ambitious and try to get at least a couple chapters processed next week. All right, folks,